Every weekday, I stopped at the same little cafe before work, not because the coffee was exceptional. It wasn't. Not because it was close to my office. It wasn't. I went because nothing ever changed. The same music, the same barista, the same people reading the same newspapers. It felt predictable. And after enough stressful mornings, predictable became my favorite thing. There was only one part of that cafe that never made sense. A small table by the front window, 2 chairs, a tiny reserved sign. Every morning. Without fail, nobody ever sat there. At first, I assumed someone important came in later. Maybe the owner. Maybe a regular customer. I didn't think much about it. A week passed, then another. The sign never moved. The table stayed empty. One morning I finally asked, "Does someone actually use that table?" The barista looked over at it, then back at me. Every morning, I smiled. "I've never seen anyone sitting there." He shrugged. "You probably weren't looking." That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. The next morning, I got there even earlier, 7:45. The reserved sign was already there. The cafe slowly filled up. People ordered coffee. Someone opened a laptop. A couple argued quietly near the back. The table by the window remained empty. 8 o'clock. 8:15. 8:30. Still nobody. Before leaving, I looked at the barista. He noticed, then casually wiped the counter. "Not today." He said it so naturally, I almost didn't react. "Who?" He looked confused. "The person you're waiting for." "Oh," he smiled. "Maybe tomorrow." That was it. No explanation, no mystery. He simply moved on to the next customer. For the next month, I couldn't stop paying attention to that table. It became ridiculous. I'd walk in, and the first thing I'd look at wasn't the menu. It was the window. Reserved. Every time. Sometimes the cafe was almost empty. Sometimes every other table was full. People even asked if they could sit there. The answer was always the same. "I'm sorry. That table's reserved?" Nobody argued. They simply picked another seat. As if that answer made perfect sense. One Friday. The cafe was completely packed. There wasn't a single empty chair. People were standing with takeaway cups waiting for seats. Except one. The table by the window. Still empty. Still reserved. I finally walked over. "Seriously?" The barista looked up. "I can sit there, right?" He hesitated. Only for a second. Then sighed. "I suppose. Just this once." I smiled. "Thanks." I carried my coffee over, sat down, and for the first time, I understood why everyone liked that table. The morning sunlight came straight through the window. You could see the entire street. It was easily the best seat in the cafe. I couldn't understand why nobody ever used it. About 5 minutes later, the barista walked over. He placed my refill on the table. Then, without saying a word, he set a second cup of coffee on the empty chair across from me. I looked up. I didn't order that. I know. He straightened the cup, gave the empty chair a quick glance, and quietly walked away. I sat there for a few seconds, staring at the untouched coffee. Then I looked around the cafe. Nobody else seemed to notice. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody even looked in my direction. It was as if a second cup sitting in front of an empty chair was the most ordinary thing in the world. I suddenly wasn't very interested in finishing my own coffee anymore. The next morning, I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe the second cup belonged to another customer. Maybe someone had stepped outside to take a phone call. Maybe I was turning nothing into something. That explanation lasted about 30 seconds. The reserved sign was back. The table was empty. And before I even reached the counter, the barista looked at me and smiled. The usual? Yeah. As he prepared my coffee, I nodded towards the window. So, did your regular ever show up yesterday? He looked over at the table. No. That's a shame. He shrugged. It happens. That answer somehow bothered me even more. There was no disappointment in his voice, no frustration, just acceptance. The following week, I stopped asking questions. Instead, I started watching. Not constantly. Just enough to satisfy my curiosity. Every morning, someone would walk toward that table. They'd notice the reserved sign. Pause for a second. Then quietly choose another seat. Nobody complained. Nobody rolled their eyes. It was almost as if everyone who came into that cafe already knew the rules. Everyone, except me. A few days later, I arrived earlier than usual. The barista was still arranging pastries behind the counter. The cafe was almost empty. The reserved sign wasn't on the table yet. For the first time, it was just another table. I watched him finish wiping the counter. Then, without looking toward the window, he picked up the small wooden sign, walked over, placed it carefully in the center of the table, straightened it, adjusted one of the chairs slightly, then returned behind the counter. The entire routine took less than 15 seconds, but it didn't feel like someone preparing a table. It felt like someone greeting a guest. That Friday, I stayed longer than usual, nearly an hour. People came and went. Coffee cups were cleared away. New customers arrived. The reserved table never changed. Around 9:30, an older woman walked in. She stopped beside the window, looked at the empty table, then smiled. Not at me. Not at the barista at the table. She quietly whispered, "Still waiting." The barista nodded. As always. She ordered tea, sat somewhere else, and never looked toward the window again. I don't know why, but hearing someone else acknowledge that table made everything feel much stranger. The following Monday, I couldn't help myself. As I paid for my coffee, I asked, "Can I ask you something?" The barista smiled. "You just did." I laughed. "No, about the table." His smile faded just a little. "What about it? Who exactly are you waiting for?" He thought for a moment, then answered, "We're not." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The table is." Before I could respond, another customer walked in. The conversation ended. Just like that, for the rest of the morning, those 4 words stayed in my head. "We're not. The table is." It didn't make any sense. Tables don't wait for people. People wait for people. Still, I found myself glancing toward the window every few minutes, almost expecting someone to finally sit down. Nobody ever did. By the end of that week, something had changed. I no longer looked at the reserved sign first. I looked at the empty chair across from it, because without realizing it, I'd started wondering who the second cup had really been for. The answer came the following Tuesday, and after that morning, I never looked at that cafe the same way again. The following Tuesday, I walked into the cafe at exactly 8:30. For some reason, I checked my watch before opening the door. 8:30. The reserve table was empty. The sign was still there. Everything looked exactly the same. I ordered my coffee. The barista handed me the cup, then asked, "Your usual table?" I smiled. "I don't have a usual table." He looked at me for a second, long enough for me to wonder if I'd said something strange. Then he simply nodded. "Right." I carried my coffee to another seat. A few minutes later, someone entered the cafe. Not unusual. People came in every few minutes. But this person didn't even look at the menu. He walked straight toward the reserved table, stopped beside it, looked at the sign, smiled. Then, without sitting down, he quietly walked back outside. The entire cafe carried on as if nothing had happened. Nobody reacted. Nobody watched him leave. Only me. I looked at the barista. "Aren't you going to stop him?" The barista frowned. "Stop who?" "The man who just walked in." He stared at me. The door never opened. I didn't answer. I simply stood up, walked to the window, looked outside. The sidewalk was empty. No one. Not even across the street. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been distracted. Maybe I needed more sleep the next morning. I didn't go back. or the morning after that, instead. I found another cafe on my way to work. The coffee wasn't as good. The service was slower. But there were no reserved tables, no empty chairs, no questions I couldn't answer. After a few weeks, I stopped thinking about it. At least, I thought I had, almost 3 months later. I happened to walk past the old cafe during lunch. Without thinking, I looked through the front window. The table was still there. The reserved sign hadn't moved. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered, except for one thing. There were 2 cups of coffee on the table. One was still full. The other was empty. I stood there for several seconds, trying to convince myself someone had simply stepped away. Then the barista looked up. He saw me through the glass, smiled, walked over to the window. He didn't open the door. He didn't wave. He simply pointed at the empty chair. Then at his watch. 8:30. The same time. I had walked into that cafe every single morning. The same time. I'd sat at that table for the first time. The same time. I'd stopped coming. I left before he could come outside. I never went back. Sometimes, when I'm passing that street, I still glance through the window. The table is always there. The sign is always there. Reserved. I don't know who it's waiting for. And I don't think I want to know. Thanks for watching. Sleep well.